immediately seizing central space. This pawn advance dictates the early game's dynamic and opens diagonals for potential piece development. Initiating a Sicilian defense crafts immediate central tension, daring white to overextend and creating asynchronous pawn structures for dynamic imbalances. Developing the knight to f3 directly prepares for kingside castling, while also challenging black's central pawn structure and controlling key squares. Developing the knight to a central square strengthens black's pawn structure and prepares for further piece activity in this sharp Sicilian defense. Unleashing central pressure. This move immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens critical diagonals for white's pieces. The pawn structure solidifies, opening lines and inviting piece play across the now contested d-file. Recapturing the pawn immediately opens lines, creating an active central presence for your knight. Developing a piece to pressure the central pawn and prepare for castling. Knight on f6 embraces the open Sicilian's dynamic spirit. Developing the knight solidifies central control and prepares for further piece activity. Maintaining pressure on black's setup. Solidifying the center. d6 prepares to develop the bishop and potentially launch a kingside pawn storm later. Pinning the knight immediately creates a strategic bind, preparing to exploit any pressure on the kingside or control of central squares by potentially forcing a pawn advance or disrupting piece coordination if black is not careful. Preparing to challenge the central pawn structure. Black liberates their dark squared bishop and aims to solidify their kingside defenses, setting the stage for potential pawn breaks like g6 or d5 in the future. Shielding the bishop's diagonal and preparing for kingside castling. This tempo gain also eyes potential queenside pawn advances down the road. Proactively fencing off the b5 square. This maneuver prevents white's bishop from comfortably settling there, while also preparing for potential pawn advancements on the queenside, aiming to expand black's influence and perhaps launch an attack. Castling queenside dramatically amplifies white's attacking potential, establishing a powerful pawn storm on the kingside and opening the h-file for immediate rook activity against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Challenging white's established kingside battery. Black proactively seeks to disrupt the bishop's influence and potentially create a safe haven for their own king, though this pawn advance also subtly weakens the dark squares around their monarch, inviting future positional play. Seeking to bolster the pawn chain and prepare for a queenside pawn storm. White repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses around black's castled king and simultaneously defending the crucial d4 square, unburdening the central pawn structure after the knight's forced retreat. This exchange aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed queenside castle and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it concedes the bishop pair and cedes some central influence. Recapturing with the bishop opens up the diagonal for the queen and frees the knight from its defensive duty, allowing it to potentially redeploy to a more active square and intensifying pressure on black's queenside development. Unleashing a pawn thrust on the queenside. Black aims to seize vital space and create counterplay, potentially disrupting white's castled king's safety or opening lines for their pieces, while simultaneously challenging white's bishop's dominance on the a2-8 diagonal. Unleashing the f-pawn creates an immediate pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure and open lines towards the enemy monarch, though it does leave the d4 knight's retreat somewhat compromised and potentially invites counterplay along the queenside by black's active pieces. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for castling. This bishop relocation opens up the diagonal for the queen and allows the kingside pieces to potentially develop more harmoniously without immediate tactical threats on the kingside, establishing a potent diagonal and eyeing the kingside. This bishop repositioning aims to participate actively in the unfolding battle, potentially supporting pawn advances or initiating an attack against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Black boldly injects immediate dynamism into the queenside, creating a dynamic pawn wedge that seeks to disrupt white's intended development and territorial control. This aggressive probing aims to exploit the slightly uncoordinated placement of white's minor pieces, particularly the bishop on d3, by forcing them to react defensively and potentially concede valuable space or suffer piece inactivity. Shifting the knight to a less aggressive square like e2, while seemingly passive, prepares a potential kingside pawn storm or facilitates better piece coordination by clearing the way for f5 and reinforcing the d4 square. The queen boldly advances, seeking to exploit the slightly uncoordinated pieces on the queenside and create immediate pressure on the c3 knight, potentially disrupting white's castled king's safety. Exchanging the bishop opens up the g-file and sacrifices a positional pawn for potential attacking chances down that freshly cleared avenue, while also forcing black to address the immediate threat to their king's safety. Accepting the bishop exchange solidifies black's pawn structure on the kingside and opens the g-file for potential counterplay, though it relinquishes the bishop pair, which can be a significant positional advantage in open positions. Pivoting the bishop to this square prepares for a potential kingside attack by clearing the d-file for the queen and rook, while also creating threats against the black queen and potentially targeting weaknesses around the castled king. Embracing castle completion, black secures their monarch behind a protective pawn wall, a vital step in stabilizing the position after white's aggressive castling and pawn advances. This defensive maneuver, while seemingly passive, strategically repositions the king to safety, allowing black to focus on developing their pieces and counterplay, particularly on the queenside where their pawn majority awaits. It's a testament to the enduring principle of king safety as the bedrock of any sound chess strategy, especially in a dynamically unbalanced position like this one. Unleashing a queen sacrifice to disrupt the opponent's castled fortress, white seeks to exploit the exposed position of the black king by creating immediate threats and opening lines for attack. The bishop retreats to a potentially safer square, but it sacrifices its influence on the crucial a8h1 diagonal, which was previously pressuring white's castled king and could have been a launchpad for further queenside counterplay alongside the rook. Now, the d3 bishop enjoys unchallenged dominance, and the queenside pawns are less likely to advance effectively without active support. This repositioning feels like a defensive concession rather than a proactive attempt to regain the initiative. White aims to dislodge black's queen from the powerful a5 square, a key piece in black's offensive setup. By forcing the queen to move, white hopes to gain breathing room and potentially develop an attack on the kingside, exploiting the open files created by the pawn exchanges. The bishop on c4, after its initial placement, now seeks to apply pressure along the diagonal, possibly eyeing squares around black's king should it remain exposed. The rook slides to the open d-file, aiming to contest control and potentially exert pressure on white's central structure. This establishes a robust defensive anchor for the black king while simultaneously preparing for future operations along the rank or supporting advances on the queenside. Pivoting the queen to e3 seizes a more active central square, eyeing potential advances on the kingside and reinforcing the light square bishop's influence. Unleashing the rook, black asserts immediate pressure along the open d-file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and contest control of this crucial pathway. Shifting the bishop to the diagonal opens up a direct assault on black's kingside. Leveraging the now somewhat exposed king position after black's earlier pawn moves. It's a calculated risk that anticipates black's likely attempts to consolidate their queen's rook and potentially challenge the center. A sharp tactical skirmish ignites as black reroutes the queen, not only challenging white's centralized bishop but also subtly preparing to seize control of the crucial d-file, a potential corridor for future rook infiltration. Liberating the queens from the board decisively simplifies the material count and steers the game towards a strategic endgame. The queen trade simplifies the position dramatically, but black's rook now faces a crucial decision. Establish a presence on the open c-file to challenge white's remaining rook or retreat to defend the queenside pawns. This choice will dictate the immediate territorial battle and hint at future defensive strategies. A curious repositioning. This knight abandons the center's immediate fray for a more circuitous route to potentially influence the kingside or the d4 square. Consider whether this knight's new home on g3 offers a superior vantage point compared to its previous presence on e2. And how it might assist in building an attack or bolstering defenses. Unleashing a pawn's potential on the queenside. This advance aims to disrupt white's bishop pair's dominance and potentially create a new outpost for black's pieces. Liberating the bishop from its cramped diagonal, the piece now eyes the queenside, preparing to exert pressure on the a-file and potentially support an advance of the queenside pawns, or regroup to a more active square, while simultaneously shoring up the pawn structure on the queenside. A courageous attempt to disrupt white's queenside initiative by forcing exchanges and liberating the bishop, though it risks weakening the pawn structure around the king if white can cleverly exploit the open lines. Reasserting control over the central files. This rook maneuver aims to tie down black's pieces and potentially exploit the open e-file should the opportunity arise, while simultaneously reinforcing the queenside advance. Unleashing a dynamic pawn thrust. Black aggressively challenges white's central presence and opens up fascinating attacking possibilities on the kingside. A bold counterstroke aiming to disrupt the opponent's developing harmony and exploit the rather exposed position of white's monarch. Unleashing the pawn storm opens critical lines and creates immediate threats against black's king. A daring gambit to exploit the recent structural weaknesses. Unleashing a powerful check. Black disrupts white's nascent kingside attack and initiates a crucial pawn grab, aiming to capitalize on the newly opened g-file for potential counterplay against the castled king, while simultaneously exposing white's misplaced knight and creating dynamic attacking possibilities. A quiet king repositioning, shielding from potential queenside invasion and preparing for a more active role in the center or a potential kingside regroup. The rook's arrival on the open d-file immediately puts pressure on white's somewhat exposed king, hinting at aggressive intentions and a desire to exploit the king's currently cramped position. Shifting the rook to the third rank initiates a fascinating positional maneuver, aiming to secure the king's safety while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move subtly repositions white's forces, creating a defensive shield and offering more flexibility should black attempt to exploit the open files. It anticipates a potential buildup of pressure and prioritizes structural integrity. A bold attempt to activate the bishop, though it invites immediate tactical scrutiny. The bishop's new perch, while aiming for queenside activity, leaves the a6 square potentially vulnerable and might overextend the rook on c8 if white responds with a central pawn push. Consider the implications for pawn structure and piece coordination over the next few turns. This piece placement could become a target. A pivotal moment as white decisively sacrifices the exchange, aiming to simplify into an endgame where their superior pawn structure and active king might offer winning chances despite the material deficit. The black bishop, now freed from its pawn shield, actively joins the fight for control of the crucial d-file, establishing a strong defensive presence and preparing to contest the open lines that have emerged. The rook's repositioning aims to contest the open d-file, now that the exchanges have cleared the way. Pushing the h-pawn now aims to create some breathing room on the kingside and potentially launch a later kingside attack, but it weakens the pawn structure around black's king and might open up lines for white's rook on the h-file if white decides to bring it into the game later. Seeking to fracture black's queenside pawn structure, white aims to create immediate attacking chances on the open a-file after the pawn exchange. Challenging the pawn on a3 by advancing the pawn on the 6th rank immediately creates an imbalance, aiming to disrupt white's development and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces. This aggressive pawn thrust seeks to gain space on the queenside and could lead to further exchanges or create weaknesses in white's pawn structure if not handled precisely. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority by initiating trades, white aims to create a passed pawn on the a-file, potentially transforming the ensuing endgame into a race against black's isolated passed pawn. Gaining control of that open file is now a priority, as the rook swings over to support the isolated pawn and pressure the opponent's back rank. A bold attempt to seize initiative on the queenside, pushing the pawn forward to challenge black's advanced structure and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it simultaneously weakens the queenside pawn chain and requires careful follow-up to avoid being exploited. A sharp consolidation of black's central pawn majority begins as the bishop repositions to the strategic diagonal, eyeing white's potentially vulnerable queenside pawns and preparing to exert pressure along the open lines that have emerged. Securing the d-file with the rook after the exchange aims to solidify white's grip on the central column, potentially opening avenues for further pressure or preparing for a kingside advance by forcing black to commit their rook. The bishop now repositions to b6, eyeing the d4 square and the potential for future central influence, while also providing a safe haven from the recent exchanges and offering a better defensive outlook. On the queenside, a bold attempt to cram black's pawns onto the queenside, but the rook's deep penetration now forces a crucial decision regarding the isolated queenside majority. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice, black seeks to shatter white's central structure, hoping the ensuing pawn chain will crumble under pressure and expose weaknesses. This audacious pawn push aims to disrupt white's tightly knit setup and inject dynamic complications into an otherwise static position, potentially creating opportunities for counterplay in the ensuing melee. Initiating a bold pawn thrust to disrupt black's pawn chain, this opens lines while potentially exposing your own king. A daring gamble, forcing white's rook to a more active, yet exposed, central square, potentially creating endgame opportunities if black can untangle the pieces effectively. Unleashing a surprising pawn sacrifice, the rook boldly ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain an outpost on the b6 square. This aggressive maneuver forces black to make a critical decision regarding the capture, potentially opening up lines for white's remaining pieces and creating tactical complications as The game progresses towards a more open and dynamic phase, reclaiming material and disrupting white's initiative. The bishop's advance forces a crucial reassessment of the board's fractured pawn structure, initiating a daring rook sacrifice to shatter black's pawn structure and seize the initiative, aiming to exploit the open files that will inevitably arise. The material imbalance is stark, with your queen gone for a bishop and 2 pawns. A dangerous situation indeed. The unleashed king on g2 suddenly appears incredibly exposed, a sitting duck for any coordinated attack from the remaining black pieces. The pawn's advance to b6 creates a powerful, unstoppable passed pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and control the queenside. Seizing the initiative with an unexpected pawn capture, black plunges into a tactical skirmish, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open new avenues for attack. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, this advance forces a re-evaluation of the board's geometry. The rook now ventures to b4, a daring maneuver aiming to exploit the exposed white king and disrupt the pawn structure's integrity. Unleashing a decisive discovered check. This regal sortie aims to dislodge the black king from its relative safety and immediately simplifies the position towards a favorable endgame for white. The black king, exposed and vulnerable on the 7th rank, finds itself in immediate peril as the rook on c8 pivots to deliver a powerful check. Ascending the b-file to queen dramatically shifts the game's balance, immediately introducing a powerful new threat and forcing black to react defensively rather than pursue their own attacking initiatives. The rook's sacrifice, while visually striking with the pawn's imminent promotion, relinquishes crucial defensive capabilities, leaving the black king exposed to a swift checkmating attack. The newly crowned queen glares across the checkered expanse, the remnant of a pawn's ambition now the dominant force, setting the stage for a decisive endgame where white's material advantage and central queen will surely dictate the pace against black's scattered, exposed monarch. The bishop's relocation aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, specifically targeting the potentially isolated pawn on the b-file, while also preparing to support any future pawn advances on the queenside.